How did a painfully shy naval officer, a man who famously confessed he felt more like a naval officer than a king and a minor German princess, from a morganatic and perpetually indebted family, become the unlikely yet profoundly successful founders of the most famous royal dynasty in the modern world? This is the central, agonizing paradox of King George V and Queen Mary. They were not figures of dazzling charisma like their predecessor, Edward VII, nor were they monumental sovereigns like their grandmother, Queen Victoria. They were instead figures of profound, almost severe duty. In an age of unprecedented global upheaval of world war, revolution, and the total collapse of empires, this quiet, conservative couple navigated a storm that destroyed their contemporaries, not through brilliance or innovation, but through an unyielding, methodical, and ultimately revolutionary dedication to service. Their story is the story of how the British monarchy adapted to survive, transforming itself from a ruling dynasty of German aristocrats into a national symbol of British domesticity and resilience. Prince George of Wales was the spare, and he was perfectly content with his station. Born in 1865, he was the second son of the glamorous Prince and Princess of Wales, the future Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, while his older brother, Prince Albert Victor, Eddie, was groomed for the throne. George was allowed to pursue his true passion, the Royal Navy. He loved the rigid, ordered, and unpretentious life of a sailor. He was, by nature, a conservative, simple man. He had a gruff, quarterdeck temper, preferred a quiet evening collecting stamps to a lavish court ball, and held deeply conventional views on art, politics, and society. He was, in short, overlooked. Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, May, born in 1867, was in an even more precarious position. Her mother was a British princess, but her father, the Duke of Teck, was the product of a morganatic, unequal marriage, placing the family in a lower, almost awkward rank of European royalty. They were Serene Highnesses, not Royal Highnesses, a distinction that mattered immensely. They were also notoriously poor, living in genteel exile in Europe to escape their London creditors. Mary was intelligent, cultured, and possessed an ironclad sense of duty, but she was seen as a poor, minor German choice for any great throne. What if your entire life, your career, your home, your spouse, your destiny, was not chosen by you, but was instead decided in a matter of days by the tragic, unexpected death of your older brother? This is the central, defining question of King George V's existence. He had crafted a life for himself in the Royal Navy, a life of clear rules, masculine camaraderie, and tangible purpose, far from the suffocating intrigues and public scrutiny of the court. He was set to be the Sailor Duke, a respected supporting figure, but never the main actor. Mary of Teck, similarly, had secured her future by becoming engaged to the heir to the throne, a position that would solve her family's status and financial problems forever. Both of their futures, one of comfortable obscurity and one of defined ambition, were completely, irrevocably, and instantly shattered by a single invisible microbe. The event would force them both into a new, unwanted reality, binding them together not by passion or choice, but by the cold, ironclad demands of dynastic continuity. In the cold winter of 1892, the British Empire was gripped by the Russian flu pandemic. The royal family, celebrating the 28th birthday of Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence at Sandringham, was not immune. Eddie, the charming, dissolute, and intellectually vacant heir to the throne, fell ill with influenza, which quickly developed into severe pneumonia. On January 14, 1892, just over a month after he had become officially engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, he died. The nation was plunged into mourning. Queen Victoria, now burying her grandson, was faced with a severe dynastic crisis. The succession, which had seemed so secure, now rested on her shy, unprepared sailor grandson, George. Furthermore, the carefully arranged political and personal match with Mary of Teck was now void. Victoria, in her famously pragmatic and ruthless dynastic way, saw a simple solution. The suitable bride had been found. The heir was now different. The solution? The spare must marry his brother's bride. For the sake of political stability, dynastic duty, and simple convenience, George was now expected to propose to the woman who had, just weeks before, been his future sister-in-law. Following their dutiful marriage in 1893, George and Mary became the Duke and Duchess of York. They were now the future king and queen, but they lived in a strange, suspended state, perpetually in the shadows. First, they were overshadowed by the colossal, almost mythical figure of Queen Victoria, the grandmother of Europe who had defined the age. After her death in 1901, they were then completely eclipsed by George's father, the new King Edward VII. Bertie, as he was known, was a larger-than-life figure of bonhomie, diplomacy, and notorious appetites. He loved the glamour, the politics, and the pageantry of the role. In contrast, George and Mary were reserved, formal, and almost aggressively domestic. They were seen as dull, dutiful, and slightly anachronistic, even in their own time. They were the heir and spare to a magnificent globe-spanning empire. Yet they chose to live a life of quiet, almost bourgeois routine, as if waiting in the wings of a stage they never wanted to step onto. As Duke and Duchess of York, they exemplified this reserved, dutiful life. Their primary residence was not a palace, but York Cottage, a damp, cramped, and unremarkable house on the Sandringham estate that George's father had given them. It was, by all accounts, little more than a bachelor's box, but George loved it precisely because it was unpretentious and reminded him of a ship's quarters. Here, he lived as a gruff, conservative naval man, famously shouting orders to his staff as if they were midshipmen, dedicating his days to the minutiae of the estate, and most passionately to his vast and world-class stamp collection. Mary, in contrast, was intellectually sharp, organized, and deeply frustrated by the intellectual vacuum of her husband's court. She dedicated herself to study, to methodically organizing the chaotic royal households, and, most famously, to a rigid, almost fanatical obsession with the strict rules of royal protocol. This obsession was not just snobbery, it was a form of defense, a way for a woman from a lesser house to prove her unimpeachable suitability for the role she had been thrust into. In May 1910, the sailor prince was catapulted onto the throne. His father, Edward VII, died suddenly from a series of heart attacks. George's reaction was not one of ambition, but of pure, unadulterated terror. He had long dreaded this day, feeling utterly inadequate to follow his popular, diplomatic, and charismatic father. Upon hearing the news, he famously broke down, sobbing to his trusted advisor, Lord Esher, "I am a bad speaker. I have no knowledge of foreign languages. I am not clever. My father was, and my grandfather was. I am only a naval officer." He was now King Emperor George V, ruler of a quarter of the globe, from the industrial heartlands of Britain to the vast empire of India. He hated public life. He despised the complexities of politics, and he felt utterly, desperately unprepared for the crown that was now, inescapably, his. He ascended the throne not in a time of peace and prosperity, but in the white-hot center of one of the greatest constitutional crises in modern British history. The struggle over the Parliament Act of 1911. The Liberal government, led by H. Asquith, had passed a radical people's budget designed to fund new social welfare programs. The conservative-dominated hereditary House of Lords vetoed the budget, an unprecedented move that triggered a political firestorm. The government's solution was to pass a bill, the Parliament Act, that would permanently break the Lords' power of veto. To do this, they needed the new terrified and inexperienced king to make a secret politically explosive promise that if the Lords continued to obstruct the bill, King George V would agree to create over 500 new Liberal peers, flooding the chamber and guaranteeing the bill's passage. For a man who prized non-partisanship and hated politics, it was a nightmare. He was forced, in his very first months, to take a side in a bitter political war that threatened to break the very fabric of his government. How do you wage war against your own family? This was the profound, personal, and agonizing question that confronted King George V in August 1914. The Great War was not, for him, an abstract political conflict between nations. It was a dynastic civil war, a horrifying fratricidal implosion of his own extended family. Queen Victoria, his grandmother, had so successfully married her children and grandchildren into the great houses of Europe that, by 1914, the continent was a web of royal cousins. The great powers that were about to tear the world apart were all, in a very real sense, run by his relatives. This conflict was not just a failure of diplomacy. It was a failure of the entire 19th century dynastic system that was supposed to prevent such a catastrophe. It was a family feud, with machine guns, artillery, and millions of lives at stake. The year 1914 saw the world explode, and for George, the tragedy was viscerally personal. He was now at war with his first and most bombastic cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, whom he had known since childhood as Willie. Wilhelm, the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria, had a famously fraught relationship with his English relatives, but he and Georgie had sailed together and corresponded for decades. More tragically still, the war placed him in an alliance with his other first cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Nicky, whose mother was George's mother's sister, was not just a cousin. He was a close friend and a startling physical double. The two men looked so alike they could be mistaken for twins. The war, for George, was a surreal nightmare, forcing him to ally with one cousin he was fond of, against another he distrusted, in a conflict that would ultimately consume them both and threaten his own throne. While other kings, like his cousins in Germany, Austria, and Russia, largely directed their wars from remote palaces and insulated military headquarters, adopting the traditional role of the supreme warlord, George V did something radically different. He instinctively understood that this new total war was not a game of kings, but a national struggle of entire populations, and his role was not to command, but to endure with his people. He and Queen Mary, almost from the first day of the war, rejected the hidden monarch model. They understood that to maintain the monarchy's legitimacy, they had to be seen, they had to be present, and they had to be sharing in the sacrifice. This was not a calculated political strategy at first. It was an instinctive moral response from a king who saw himself as a man of simple duty. He and Queen Mary created, almost by accident, an entirely new, modern model of royal public service. They embarked on a relentless, pioneering schedule of hundreds of public engagements. George V made numerous dangerous visits to the troops on the front line in France. On one such visit in 1915, his horse, startled by the sound of cheering, reared and fell on top of him, severely breaking his pelvis, an injury that would leave him in chronic pain for the rest of his life. Queen Mary, for her part, transformed her role from society hostess to national matron. She instituted austerity at Buckingham Palace, rationing food just as the public was, and began a grueling, non-stop tour of wounded soldiers in hospitals, munitions factories, and shipyards, personally encouraging the workers and comforting the wounded. This visible, dutiful, and tireless presence forged a new, powerful bond between the monarchy and the working classes, a bond that would prove essential for its survival. What if your very name, the name of your family, the name of your ancestors, became the sound of the enemy? This was the existential crisis that blindsided the British royal family in 1917. As the war dragged into its third year, with casualties mounting into the millions and German U-boats starving the nation, anti-German fury swept Britain. Shops with German-sounding names were looted. Dachshunds were kicked in the street. This patriotic hysteria, bordering on xenophobia, turned its sights on the most prominent German family in the land, the royal family itself. The king, after all, was of pure German blood on both sides. His father's house was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. His mother was Danish, from the house of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg. His wife, Queen Mary, was a princess of Teck, from the German kingdom of Württemberg. The king was, by blood, a German. This simmering anti-German resentment exploded into a full-blown crisis in June 1917. For the first time, German Gotha G-4 heavy bombers appeared in the skies over London, conducting daylight bombing raids that killed civilians, including schoolchildren. The psychological shock was immense, and the public quickly made a devastating connection. The German bombers that were killing their children were named Gotha. Their king's family name was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. The symbolism was toxic. It was suddenly, painfully obvious that the royals were seen by many as fundamentally foreign, as Huns on the throne. The Republican author H.G. Wells famously wrote about the king's alien and uninspiring court, prompting the king to famously retort, "I may be uninspiring, but I'll be damned if I'm alien." A drastic, symbolic, and brilliant solution was needed, and it was needed immediately. In the midst of this domestic identity crisis, a world-changing event presented the king with an agonizing, impossible choice. Your cousin, your friend, your physical double, begs for his life. His wife and his young children are prisoners of a violent, revolutionary mob. You are the only person on earth, the king of the most powerful empire in the world, who can save him. And you say no. This was the cold, brutal dilemma that confronted George V in the spring of 1917. The February Revolution in Russia had forced his cousin, Nicky, Tsar Nicholas II, to abdicate. The Russian imperial family was now under house arrest, their lives in mortal peril. The new Russian provisional government, desperate to get them out of the country, formally asked Britain to grant them asylum. The year was 1917. The Russian Revolution was not just a foreign event, it was a terrifying warning. The government of Prime Minister David Lloyd George, under pressure from his Liberal and Labour allies, was deeply wary of the optics. Tsar Nicholas was despised by the British left as Bloody Nicky, a symbol of brutal autocracy. Bringing him to Britain, they argued, could provide a spark for a similar Republican uprising at home, especially at a time when the king's own German background was being questioned. While the government initially agreed to the asylum, King George III, in a rare and decisive political intervention, made a cold, fateful decision. He instructed his private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, to inform the government that, in light of the political dangers, the king must beg that the offer of asylum be withdrawn. The British government, bowing to the king's wishes, rescinded the offer. George V, in a calculated act of political survival, had prioritized the stability of his own throne over the lives of his family. He sealed the fate of the entire Russian imperial family, who would be brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks, in a cellar in Ekaterinburg a year later. How do you erase your past in a single day? How do you sever a 1,000-year-old link to your continental Germanic ancestry and, overnight, become something new, something purely, indisputably English? This was the challenge facing George V in the summer of 1917. Having sealed his cousin's fate, he now moved to save his own crown. He understood that in this new total war, symbols mattered more than blood. The German name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was a critical liability. He needed to perform a radical act of reinvention, a rebranding so total that it would permanently redefine the monarchy's identity in the minds of the British people. It would be a symbolic severing of the past, a public declaration that the king was not a German prince, but an English king, first and foremost. July 17, 1917. This was the day of the brilliant masterstroke. After much consultation, where names like Tudor Stuart and Guelph were rejected, the king's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, suggested a name that was simple, ancient, and quintessentially English. Windsor. It was perfect. It was not a personal name. It was a place. It was the name of the ancient castle, the very symbol of the monarchy's endurance and its deep roots in English soil. By royal proclamation, King George V declared that, "Our house and family shall be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor." He renounced for himself and all his relatives all German titles and dignities. In a single day, the king had performed a piece of political and public relations genius. The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was dead. Long live the House of Windsor. While the ancient mighty empires of Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary crumbled into dust, their emperors and kaisers forced into exile or executed, the British monarchy survived. Why? Why did the Romanovs, who had ruled Russia for 300 years, fall? Why did the Hohenzollerns, who had forged the modern German state, fall? Why did the Habsburgs, who had dominated Central Europe for 6 centuries, fall? Why did the Windsors, with their toxic German name, their shy king, and their unpopular cousins, manage to weather the same revolutionary storm? The answer was not in their military power or their political genius, but in the very transformation they had forced upon themselves during the war. While the other empires remained rigid, autocratic, and disconnected from their people, the British monarchy had made itself smaller, more visible, and more relevant. George V and Queen Mary had, in essence, established a new brand of monarchy for the 20th century. They had swapped the old brand of power and privilege for a new revolutionary brand of stability, domesticity, and duty. While the other emperors played the role of semi-divine autocrats, George and Mary deliberately cultivated the image of a stable, non-partisan, middle-class family who just happened to be royal. They were presented as symbols of national unity, above the dirty fray of politics. They were the stable center in a world of chaos, a living contrast to the fallen, erratic, and tyrannical empires. They had saved their crown by proving to the British people that the monarchy was not their ruler, but their chief public servant. How did this gruff, shy king, a man who was famously inarticulate and possessed a terrifying temper, become a beloved father figure to millions of people at once? George V was, by all accounts, a poor communicator. He was terrified of public speaking, and his relationship with his own children was distant and severe. Yet, in the final years of his reign, he managed to forge a direct, personal, and profoundly paternal bond with his subjects across the globe, thanks to a technology he deeply distrusted: the radio. He was not a natural media personality. He was the opposite. But it was this very lack of polish that would, paradoxically, become his greatest strength. In 1932, Sir John Wright, the visionary founder of the BBC, persuaded a deeply reluctant king to do the first-ever royal Christmas broadcast. The king hated the idea, complaining about that newfangled thing, but he dutifully agreed. On Christmas Day, from a small improvised studio at Sandringham, the king, reading a script written for him by Rudyard Kipling, spoke to the empire. His voice was not smooth or stirring. It was the voice of an old man, slightly hesitant, slightly stammering, but unmistakably paternal and sincere. The effect was electric. For the first time, the king's voice, not a proclamation read by an announcer, but his actual voice, was heard in millions of homes, from London to Sydney to Cape Town. It created an immediate, personal bond, transforming the remote king-emperor into a shared, familial grandfather, a single unifying voice for a scattered global family. Behind this quiet, gruff king stood a queen of unbending, unyielding steel. If George V was the dutiful, paternal heart of the new monarchy, Queen Mary was its rigid, ceremonial backbone. She was far more intelligent, more cultured, and more artistically aware than her husband, but she channeled all of her formidable intellect and iron will into one singular purpose: the preservation of the royal institution. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their survival depended on maintaining an aura of implacable dignity. In an age where everything was becoming casual and familiar, she insisted that the monarchy must remain separate, formal, and perfect. She was the family's ultimate enforcer, a figure of icy and intimidating propriety. Queen Mary was the family's backbone in every sense. She enforced royal protocol relentlessly, not because she was a snob, though she was, but because she believed that propriety, ritual, and the strict performance of royal duties were the very substance of the monarchy's power. It was the magic that kept the institution alive. Any deviation, any casualness, any personal scandal threatened to break that magic and, with it, the crown itself. But she was not just a disciplinarian. She was also a serious and obsessive historian. She dedicated decades of her life to the meticulous curation of the royal collection, tracking down and reacquiring thousands of pieces of royal art and furniture that had been lost or sold off over the centuries. She saw herself as the chief guardian of the monarchy's tangible physical history, preserving its legacy while her husband preserved its present. After 25 years on a throne he never wanted, having navigated a world war, a revolution, an economic collapse, and a total reinvention of the monarchy itself, the king was shocked by one simple, undeniable fact: the people loved him. The year was 1935, the occasion of his silver jubilee. George V was now an old, frail man, beloved as the grandfather of the nation, but he remained his shy, unassuming self. He expected the jubilee to be a formal, respectful, and perhaps slightly dull affair, a simple acknowledgement of his longevity. He had, in his own mind, just been doing his job, and he could not fathom why anyone would make a great fuss about it. The 1935 Silver Jubilee, however, became one of the most astonishing, massive, and genuine outpourings of public affection in British history. The reserved, shy king and queen were stunned. The streets of London, particularly in the working-class East End, were thronged with millions of cheering, waving, and celebrating subjects. The affection was palpable, real, and overwhelming. George V was genuinely baffled and deeply moved. He famously turned to his prime minister and said, "I cannot understand it. I am really a very ordinary kind of fellow." This moment was the ultimate vindication of his entire life. It was the definitive proof that the quiet, dutiful service monarchy model he and Mary had forged in the fires of war had not only saved the institution, but had made it more beloved and more secure than it had been in centuries. The king had only one profound fear for the future: his own son. As his health failed in the winter of 1935 to 1936, his body weakened by decades of heavy smoking, and the chronic lung problems exacerbated by his WWI injury, George V looked to the future of the institution he had so painstakingly rebuilt. He was confident in its foundations, but he was deeply, mortally terrified of the man who would inherit it. His eldest son, David, the Prince of Wales, who would become Edward VIII, was a global superstar. He was handsome, charismatic, modern, and wildly popular. But to his father, he was a disaster. The king saw his son as charming but profoundly selfish, unstable, and, worst of all, completely lacking in the one quality he valued above all others: a sense of duty. The king's health was failing, and his clashes with his heir became more frequent and desperate. He was deeply disturbed by David's casual approach to his royal duties, his preference for jazz clubs over state papers, and, most alarmingly, his very public, very scandalous affair with a married American woman, Wallis Simpson. The old king saw this not just as a personal failing, but as an existential threat to the crown. He famously and prophetically told his prime minister, Stanley Baldwin, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." It was perhaps the most accurate and devastating prophecy in modern royal history. He also famously said, "I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie, his second son, the future George VI, and Lilibet, the future Elizabeth II, and the throne. How did the greatest crisis in modern royal history, the abdication crisis of 1936, ironically prove the king's ultimate unqualified success? The crisis, which erupted just 10 months after George V's death, was the fulfillment of his worst fears. His eldest son, now King Edward V, did exactly as his father had predicted. Faced with a choice between his personal desire, marrying the twice-divorced Wallis Simpson, which was constitutionally and religiously unacceptable to the government and the church, and his sacred inherited duty as king, Edward VIII chose desire. He refused to give her up. He chose to abdicate the throne, plunging the nation and the empire into a constitutional crisis of unparalleled proportions, threatening to undo everything his father had built. The crisis, which occurred just after George V's death, was the fire that proved the strength of his life's work. The boy, Edward VIII, did ruin himself in less than 12 months, just as his father had prophesied. He abandoned his post. But the institution, the brand of monarchy that George V and Queen Mary had so carefully constructed, held firm. The crown was not, it turned out, dependent on the charisma of one man. It was an office of duty. The crisis passed, and the crown passed seamlessly to George V's dutiful, stammering, and terrified second son, Bertie, who took his father's name to become King George VI. He and his young daughter Elizabeth perfectly embodied the new Windsor values of service, sacrifice, and domesticity. The dynasty was secure, not despite the crisis, but because of it. The crisis had forced a choice, and the nation, the government, and the royal family itself had all chosen the dutiful model of George V over the selfish model of Edward VIII. The old king's life's work was, in the end, completely and totally vindicated.